Violin Sonata No.4 by Charles Ives is a piece from 1914, which I'm going to be exploring today because I have somehow acquired a PDF of the score. And this piece is subtitled Children's Day at the Camp Meeting. This is the first piece in any of my series where I've actually looked at Charles Ives, so after exploring the score a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about the composer, and then we're going to get into the listening session. So it's shorter than his other violin sonatas, and some of the themes in it had already been used in earlier pieces of Ives and in organ music of his, so he's reusing older material. It seems to be somewhat autobiographical. He's reflecting on his experience in growing up in Danbury, Connecticut, and meeting with other children at summer camp. And when he's talking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s here, he's talking about the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Because keep in mind, this was written in 1914. What is significant about a bunch of kids getting together and organizing like this? Well, there is usually only one day a year devoted to the children meeting together. But the adults would meet together at all the other meetings that summer. It seems to be like a little bit patriotic, like a little bit of Americana is in the program to this. Ives is trying to capture the actual music that would figure into these services. So the first movement, the children get up and join in marching kind of hymns, which often resulted in real marching outdoors if they were meeting outdoors. The experience of singing these things in a social setting is not as musical as a like classical concert, and there are like musical things that you would consider mistakes, but he's trying to capture these moments of sort of raw, folksy enjoyment of music. The second movement is based around a favorite hymn of the children. It's quieter, more serious. And the third movement is also like march-like and boisterous, like the first. And oddly enough, Ives mentions that the first movement can sometimes be played last and the last first. So the form is not necessarily 1, 2, 3. The important part is that the middle movement is in the middle. It's just kind of interesting. I'm finding it difficult to understand exactly what Ives is describing in these experiences because it's so far removed from the time and place I exist in, and even his language is just very old-fashioned, and it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly what went down in Danbury, Connecticut in these contexts, but maybe it'll become more clear once we start listening to the piece. A few things about Charles Ives. He was an American modernist composer and an experimental composer whose music was championed much later in life. He was born in the 1870s and died in the 1950s. And as you can see, this score was published in 1942, maybe even later than that. So this was around the time that he was gaining notoriety, was like quite close to the end of his life. He grew up in a very musical household, but certainly his interests took a very experimental turn, and the types of things he was interested in were um, generally very out there. Uh, he was a very virtuosic organist and musician himself, but he made his living as an actuary, and he published a famous paper on life insurance, which I think changed the field significantly. And it's a little bit similar to another composer we've looked at, Chelsea. Chelsea was also born into a wealthy family and didn't make his living off of his music, but he championed new music, and later his music was championed as being very revolutionary, but like only towards the end of his life. So that's the type of composer Ives is. You've probably heard his chamber orchestra piece, The Unanswered Question. It's performed all the time. But he has a very long list of pieces, well, a short list of pieces, which he worked on throughout his life, constantly revising. His first piece is the Variations on America for organ, which I think are a good example of what he considered to be challenging but playable organ music when he was a teenager or in his 20s. So that can give you a sense of like how virtuosic he was, not only as a composer but as a musician. Now is the point in the video where you can pause the video and have a look at the link that I provided in the description. This is the recording that I'm going to be listening to. Then please come back and I will let you know my like immediate thoughts, reactions. All right. Yeah, cool. So this really made me want to start listening to more Ives, because it was a really fascinating little piece. That middle movement really dominates the piece, and it's like very gorgeous, and there's all these extended harmonies, and I could even show you, since this is all public domain anyways. Like there's just this very like whole range of the piano, gigantic gesture thing in the climactic part of the middle movement, and we really have a lot of like romantic figuration with very clear sweeping melodies in the violin, and it's really contrasts with the two outer movements, which are a lot lighter but have their own sort of like dissonant moments and strange turns of harmony. For the most part, it just sounded like extended tonality kind of stuff, and the last movement, or the third movement rather, when we had this folk melody in the violin, I think it was called At the River. This over top of, like, it's clearly in a just narrow singing range. This over top of this very elaborate piano accompaniment. This is very, like, typical Ives. This is what I think of when I think of Ives. But that was far from the whole piece, this type of texture. It was just a fleeting moment in the third movement. And for the most part, it was a little bit more subtle than that. I can see what he means by it's like in the program note, he mentions it being assembled from older pieces. And I can definitely see that. Like there's something about the first and third movement that don't really match the second one. And I would hazard to guess that like most of his compositional effort was put into the middle movement in this. Tomorrow I'm going to be looking at the second violin sonata, and I'm going to see if it's very different from this. I think it's a heavier work. It's 50% longer, So I'm assuming this is like, of the four violin sonatas, the most programmatic and light, but we'll see. I'm not uh, that familiar with them yet, and this is sort of the beginnings of me getting into them. Yeah, if you are a violinist, I mean, definitely consider looking into the Ives, because you have a real wealth of repertoire here, I think. And especially if you're American, like, play some American repertoire. If it's over 100 years old, I think it is part of the canon. I think you can safely play it. So, yeah, those are my sort of scattered thoughts on Charles Ives' fourth violin sonata.